Nobody warned him that losing a house could feel quieter than losing a man. The foreclosure notice had come on a Tuesday, the same day his daughter stopped returning his calls, and the same week his doctor used the word chronic, in a way that didn't leave room for argument. Arthur Cobb was 63 years old, a former Army combat engineer who had survived 2 deployments to places that still showed up in his dreams uninvited. And he was standing in the driveway of a house he no longer owned, watching a county official change the locks on the front door. Bear sat beside him the whole time. The Rottweiler hadn't moved from Arthur's left side since the official's car had pulled up. He wasn't growling. He wasn't tense. He simply sat there with his broad shoulder pressed against Arthur's thigh, warm and steady, as if holding him upright by proximity alone. The official finished with the lock, gave Arthur a look that carried more pity than he wanted, and drove away without saying much. Arthur stood there another few minutes. The yard needed mowing. He'd been meaning to get to it for weeks. He loaded what was left into the truck bed. 2 duffel bags, a sleeping bag, his field kit from the service, a box of tools he'd accumulated over 30 years of fixing things that kept breaking anyway. Bear jumped into the passenger seat before Arthur had even opened the door for him, turning 3 circles on the worn fabric, before dropping his chin onto his paws and watching Arthur with those dark, patient eyes. "Where do we go?" Arthur said out loud. It wasn't really a question. Bear's ear flicked once. Arthur had grown up in western North Carolina, spent his boyhood summers roaming the lower slopes of the Blue Ridge with his grandfather, learning which mushrooms would kill you and which streams ran cold enough to keep fish lazy and slow. He hadn't been back in decades, but the mountains had stayed somewhere in the back of his mind, the way things do when they shaped you before you knew you were being shaped. He put the truck in reverse and pointed it south. He didn't tell his daughter where he was going. He'd tried calling her twice that morning. Both times it rang through to voicemail. Her voice on the recording sounded like someone he used to know well. He left no message. The drive took most of the day. Bear slept for the first 3 hours, then woke and spent the rest of the trip watching the passing landscape with the focused interest of a dog who understands that the world changes when you move through it. By the time Arthur turned off the highway onto a gravel forest road, the sky had gone the deep amber color of late afternoon, and the temperature outside the truck had dropped 10 degrees in 20 minutes. He drove until the road became more suggestion than fact, then parked where 2 old tires appeared a thicket of rhododendron. He sat for a moment with the engine ticking as it cooled, listening to the forest settle around him, wind through the canopy. A creek somewhere below. A woodpecker working at something dead and hollow. Bear lifted his head and looked at him. Arthur exhaled. "All right, let's see what we've got." They walked for about a mile, following the sound of the water downhill, through tulip poplars and hemlock. The leaves were turning, orange and rust, and a pale yellow that caught the last light like stained glass. Arthur hadn't noticed how tight his shoulders had been for the past 6 months until he felt them start to loosen somewhere around the 3rd creek crossing. He didn't know what that meant exactly. He just kept walking. The creek widened where the hillside leveled into a natural bench of flat ground. The water moved slow here, caught in a bend where a long fallen sycamore had partially blocked the flow, creating a shallow pool. Arthur crouched at the edge and ran his fingers through it, cold enough to ache. Clear all the way to the gravel bottom. He could see 3 trout holding in the current near the far bank, barely moving, working the water like they had nowhere to be. Bear drank beside him, lapping steadily, then lifted his head and stared into the woods upstream. His nostrils worked. His tail didn't move. "What is it?" Arthur murmured. The dog moved off to the left, slow and deliberate, picking his way along the bank. Arthur followed, hand resting on the hatchet at his belt out of old habit. They rounded a shelf of moss-covered rock, and Arthur stopped. The hillside above them had fractured at some point, maybe decades ago, maybe centuries, throwing a massive slab of sandstone forward and leaving a gap behind it. The slab leaned against the slope like a prop door, creating a space beneath and behind it that stretched maybe 15 feet deep and 10 feet wide. The floor was dry. The ceiling, if you could call it that, sloped from about 6 feet at the entrance down to 4 feet at the back. Arthur walked in and turned around slowly. No water damage on the walls, no animal scat, no smell of rot. Bear trotted in behind him, sniffed the corners with professional thoroughness, and sat down in the center with an air of finality. He's done looking. Arthur crouched and pressed his palm against the stone floor, still holding some warmth from the day. He looked up at the ceiling. No obvious gaps. But when he held his hand up near the back left corner, where two rock surfaces met, he felt it. A faint movement of air. Natural draft. His chest loosened in a way that had nothing to do with his lungs. He'd built field shelters in worse conditions with less to work with. He stood up and pulled the hatchet free. "We're staying," he said. Bear thumped his tail once against the ground and lay down. The first 3 days were about basics. Arthur cut poles from dead-standing timber and built a low wall across the shelter entrance, stacking them horizontally between 2 anchor posts driven into rock cracks and reinforced with wedged stone. The gaps he chinked with clay from the stream bank and handfuls of dry leaves packed tight. It wasn't airtight, and it wasn't pretty, but it stopped the wind. The hearth took longer. He built it twice. The first time, smoke filled the shelter within minutes of lighting the fire, rolling low across the floor in a way that made his eyes burn and his damaged lungs seize. He put the fire out and sat outside in the cold, coughing into his sleeve until his ribs ached and his vision grayed at the edges. Bear came and stood over him. Not pacing, not whining, just standing there with his weight draped partially across Arthur's lap, waiting. "I know," Arthur rasped. He ran a hand along the dog's side. "I'm working on it." The second version of the hearth used a different geometry. Arthur spent an afternoon studying how the air moved through the shelter at different times of day, watching which way dust moved, noticing where the cold came from and where it tried to go. The draft in the back corner moved upward. If he built the fire closer to that corner and funneled the smoke toward it with a curved wall of stacked stone, the chimney effect might pull instead of push. He built that version in the evening and lit it after dark. The smoke rose, wavered, then leaned toward the back corner and disappeared upward through the gap. Arthur sat back on his heels and watched for a long time. The fire settled into itself, burning clean and steady. He exhaled a breath he felt like he'd been holding for 3 days, maybe longer. Bear stretched out beside the fire with his chin on Arthur's knee, and for a while neither of them moved. The food problem he'd known was coming. He'd brought enough dry goods for a week: rice, oatmeal, some dried beans, a few cans. But a week was not winter, and winter in the Blue Ridge doesn't negotiate. He started setting snares on the 4th day, simple wire loops positioned along game trails he'd found while gathering wood. His grandfather had taught him the mechanics at age 11, crouching in the November leaves with the patient precision of a man who believed in passing things down. First morning, nothing. Second morning, a rabbit. He cleaned it with the practiced economy of someone who'd done it before and didn't enjoy it, but understood the necessity. He cooked it slow over the fire, and Bear got the bones and scraps, which he accepted with the gravity of a creature who understood where food came from. The creek held fish. Arthur made a simple rod from a straight length of hickory and used wire from his kit for line, bending a hook from a safety pin and testing several lures before finding that a small bit of rabbit gut worked better than anything else. He stood in the cold water in his boots, which dried slowly by the fire each night, and pulled 3 trout in his first hour of serious fishing. He felt something shift in him that afternoon, something quiet and structural, the way a foundation settles. Standing in that creek with cold water pushing against his shins and a live fish pulling at the line in his hands. He was not a man who had lost his house. He was not a man whose daughter didn't call back. He was just a man standing in a creek, doing what needed doing, same as he had always done. Bear sat on the bank, watching him with an expression that looked in the slanted afternoon light, almost like satisfaction. The first real test came 12 days in, when the temperature dropped 30 degrees overnight, and a gray sky pressed down over the ridge like a lid being closed. Arthur felt the pressure change in his sinuses before he saw the clouds. He'd grown up reading weather the way other people read faces, and this face said incoming. He spent the morning tripling the wood supply inside the shelter, hauling load after load up from the deadfall zone below the creek. His arms burned, his bad hip complained. He stopped twice to breathe through the tightness in his chest. Hands on his knees, Bear circling behind him, with a low, concerned sound in his throat. "I'm fine," Arthur said, straightening. Bear stared at him with flat skepticism. The snow started at midday. Light at first, the flakes small and hard, ticking against the dead slob. By late afternoon it was coming sideways, driven by wind that had found the gaps in the hillside and was working them hard. Arthur got the fire burning high and reinforced the door wall, pushing additional poles across the gaps and packing more clay into the seams. He worked until his fingers were too cold to grip properly, then came inside and held his hands over the fire until sensation returned in painful waves. Bear had stationed himself at the door, lying across the base of it. His weight helped hold it against the wind. "You didn't plan that," Arthur told him. "Or maybe you did. Hard to tell with you." Bear's tail swept the ground twice without any change in expression. The storm ran through the night and into the next morning. Arthur slept in broken pieces, waking each time the wind gusted hard, checking the fire, checking the door, checking Bear. Around 3 in the morning the smoke changed. He noticed it before he understood it. A different quality to the air, slightly heavier, carrying an edge that didn't belong to clean burning wood. He sat up. The fire was still burning, but the smoke wasn't rising the way it should. It was backing up, curling out along the ceiling, instead of moving toward the draft corner. "The vent's blocked," he said aloud. "Snow. Has to be snow." Bear was already on his feet. Arthur grabbed his hatchet and pulled on his jacket, not bothering with the second layer. No time. He pushed the door open against the weight of drifted snow and stepped out into a world that had been completely remade. The wind hit him like a wall. The snow was past his knees. He couldn't see the creek. He couldn't see 10 feet in any direction. He moved along the rock face by feel, keeping one hand on the sandstone slab, using it as a guide wall. The vent opening was at the back of the shelter exterior, where the stone fractured upward. He found it by position rather than sight, a narrow gap that should have been seeping smoke and wasn't. When he reached in, his fingers hit packed snow, cold and dense. He chipped at it with the hatchet, short, careful strikes in total darkness, unable to see what he was hitting. The cold came through his jacket in the first 2 minutes. His fingers stopped hurting after 5, which he recognized as a warning and kept moving anyway. He could hear Bear somewhere behind him, not barking, just breathing, close and constant, a sound to steer by. The blockage broke on the 7th strike. He felt the pressure change before he saw anything, and then smoke came rolling out over his hands and upward into the darkness, clear. He turned to move back toward the entrance, and his foot went out from under him on the ice-coated rock. He caught himself with both hands, scraping his palms open, and dropped to one knee in the drift. Bear was there in the next second, pushing under his arm from the right side, bracing. Arthur grabbed the thick fur at the dog's shoulder and pushed himself up. They moved back to the entrance together, Bear matching his pace exactly, and fell inside in a stumbling heap, trailing snow and cold air. The fire had choked down to embers. Arthur fed it carefully, hands shaking, adding kindling first, and then small branches, waiting for each piece to catch before adding the next. His lungs were doing something he didn't like, a tight crackling on the inhale that he'd been ignoring for 2 weeks. He ignored it more deliberately now. Bear curled himself along Arthur's left side, pressed close from hip to shoulder, and stayed there while Arthur's core temperature came back up. The fire grew. The smoke moved correctly now, drawn up and out through the freed vent. Arthur watched it for a long time. "You went out there with me," he said quietly. "Didn't have to do that." Bear didn't move except to let out a slow breath that warmed the side of Arthur's neck. Arthur stayed awake until first light. Not out of anxiety, exactly. More like the feeling after a long mission when sleep didn't come right away, because the body needed time to understand that it was over. He sat with his back against the rock wall and his hand resting on Bear's ribs, feeling them rise and fall, and thought about very little. When the storm broke, it broke completely. The sky went from white to pale blue to a hard, clear color that had no gentleness in it. Sunlight hit the snow with a brightness that hurt to look at directly. Bear went out first, bounding into the drifts with an impracticality that made Arthur laugh for the first time, and he couldn't remember how long. They checked the creek together. The snares had been flattened by snow, but were intact. The fish pool was crusted with ice at the edges but still open in the center. The dam he'd been meaning to build, a proper one, not just the fallen sycamore, needed to happen before the next storm. He started it that afternoon while the sun was still high, carrying flat stones from the creek bed and stacking them in a low arc across the narrow point just above the pool. Bear dragged smaller rocks to him, gripping them in his mouth or nosing them along the gravel bar, with the focused persistence of a creature who had decided this was his job now. The dam took 2 days to build right. Arthur placed the capstones on the second afternoon, just as the light went copper and thin, and he stood back and watched the water pool behind it, slowing and deepening, the surface going still. Fish moved into the new calm almost immediately, dark shapes sliding in from the current. "There's dinner," he said. Bear sat beside him, panting. On the 15th day, Arthur was splitting wood near the entrance when he heard something above him on the slope. He stopped and held still. Bear's head came up, eyes tracking left. A man was picking his way down through the trees, moving carefully, but without hesitation, the way someone moves in terrain they know. He was old, mid-70s at least, wearing canvas work pants and a coat that had been washed so many times the color had given up, trying to be any particular thing. He carried a walking stick that looked hand-carved and a canvas sack over one shoulder. He stopped about 20 feet away and raised one hand, palm out. "Morning," he said. His voice was unhurried. Bear stood but didn't move forward. His tail was still, but it wasn't tucked. "Morning," Arthur said. "Saw smoke for 3 days before I came down." The man looked at the shelter entrance, at the stacked wood, at the dam visible downstream. Wanted to see who was doing the building. His name was Earl Maddox. He'd lived in a cabin 3 ridges over for 11 years. Before that in Asheville. Before that somewhere. He didn't talk about in the same way. Arthur didn't talk about certain places. He knew these mountains the way you only know a place, when you've made a deliberate choice to learn it rather than just pass through. He noticed things, the way Arthur moved, the way Bear watched, the way the shelter had been built with structural intention rather than panic. "You've done this before," Earl said. "Not a question." "Different context," Arthur replied. Earl nodded like that, answered everything, which maybe it did. He'd brought dried venison and a jar of apple butter and a folded piece of oilcloth that was better than anything Arthur had for keeping water off his sleeping bag. He set it all near the entrance without making a production of it. "Winter gets mean in February," Earl said. "Meaner than people expect who haven't spent one here. Cold isn't the problem. Ice is the problem. You'll want to watch the runoff when it starts to melt. Creek can come up fast enough to surprise you." Arthur absorbed this. "I'll watch it." Earl spent an hour. He looked at the hearth setup and made one suggestion about the angle of the back stone that Arthur tried the next morning and immediately understood was correct. He scratched Bear behind the ears, and Bear leaned into it with the large rice trust extended to very few people. Before he left, Earl stopped at the shelter entrance and turned back. "You're not the first veteran to end up out here," he said. "And you won't be the last. Mountain doesn't care what you were, just what you do with what you've got left." Arthur stood there after Earl disappeared back into the trees, turning that over. Bear pressed against his leg. February came in like Earl had warned, sharp and wet and mean. Ice storms were worse than snow. They came without the drama, glazing everything overnight, making every surface treacherous, coating the woodpile with a shell that had to be broken before he could burn it. Arthur slipped twice on the rock shelf above the shelter. The second time, he caught himself on one knee and stayed there a moment, breathing through the close call, before he trusted himself to stand again. Bear had started anticipating these moments before they happened. Arthur didn't know how. Some shift in his posture or pace that the dog had learned to read. But in the weeks since the storm, Bear had begun positioning himself downhill from Arthur whenever they moved on uneven ground. Just there, like a counterweight. Arthur noticed and said nothing, but he adjusted his movement to account for it. The two of them working out a language of terrain without ever naming it. He thought about his daughter on the quiet evenings. Not with anger, the way he sometimes had in the first weeks after the foreclosure, more with the particular sadness of someone who understands how a relationship can erode the same way a bank erodes, slowly, invisibly, and then all at once in a way that seems sudden only to people who weren't watching. He'd been hard to reach, he knew. Not just in the last year, for a long time before. The war doesn't come out of you in a way that leaves room for everything that was there before it, and some people can carry that alongside you, and some people can't. And some people stop trying in ways you don't notice until it's far too late. He'd write her a letter when he had something worth saying. He wasn't there yet, but it was the first time the thought had formed as intention rather than regret. And that felt like something. The fish were consistent through February. The dam held. The snares averaged 1 rabbit every 3 days, which combined with the fish was enough to keep him from thinking too much about food. He supplemented with the dried stores he'd brought, making them last by being careful in the way the military teaches you. Not hoarding, just accounting. Knowing what you have, using what you need. Planning 2 steps ahead. One morning in the 3rd week of February, Bear found something in the back corner of the shelter. Arthur had stacked extra firewood there, pushed against the lowest part of the rock ceiling, and the dog was nosing at the wall behind the stack with focused attention. Arthur moved the wood and found that the 2 rock surfaces he'd taken for solid wall didn't meet evenly. There was a gap behind them, hidden by shadow and the wood pile, maybe 4 inches wide at the widest point. Cold air moved through it outward, slow and steady. He got his lantern and held it close. The gap ran back farther than he could see. The air moving through it came from somewhere deeper, which meant the rock wasn't solid behind it, which meant the shelter he'd found wasn't all there was. He looked at Bear. Bear looked back at him with the expression of a dog who has been waiting for you to notice something for quite some time. "I see it," Arthur said. He didn't open it that night. He was tired, and the fire needed tending, and some things are better approached in daylight with full energy and clear eyes. But he lay on his sleeping bag that night with one arm behind his head, listening to Bear breathe and the fire settle, and thought about the gap in the wall. About what was behind it. About the fact that this mountain kept offering him more than he'd come looking for. He'd come here to survive. That had been the whole plan. Just get through the winter. Just keep himself and Bear alive. Until he could figure out what came next. He hadn't expected the dam, or the hearth that worked, or Earl Maddox coming down the ridge with dried venison and a better angle on the back stone. He hadn't expected the way the forest had started to feel familiar again, the way it had when he was young, or the way Bear had figured out how to keep him upright on ice, without either of them ever talking about it. He hadn't expected to stop dreaming about the deployments, but somewhere in the last 2 weeks he'd noticed their absence. The way you notice silence after a long noise. The sleep was deeper out here. Whether that was exhaustion, or the cold, or the lack of walls and ceilings and all the things that used to remind him of other places, he couldn't say. He pulled out his folding knife before the fire got too low and moved to a patch of smooth sandstone near the entrance, the same stone he'd leaned against the first night in the shelter. He worked carefully in the firelight, cutting into the surface. The stone was softer than it looked and took the blade well. When he was done, he held the lantern close and read it back. Built by one soldier and one good dog. Blue Ridge, winter. Bear came over and sniffed the carving with great seriousness. "That's us," Arthur told him. Bear sat down beside the inscription and looked up at him with those dark, steady eyes that had never once asked him to be anything other than exactly what he was. Arthur sat down next to him. The fire was low but holding. Outside, the mountain was quiet under its mantle of ice and dark, the creek running somewhere below them, steady and cold and faithful, the same water it had always been, going the same direction it had always gone, indifferent to everything, and somehow, for that reason alone, deeply comforting. He didn't know what was behind that gap in the wall. He'd find out in the morning. He didn't know what came after winter, what the letter to his daughter would say, whether the life on the other side of all this loss would have any resemblance to the one before it. But he was going to survive this mountain, not because he'd planned it right, or been lucky, or because the damage inside him was somehow less than it looked, because Bear was beside him and the fire was holding, and the dam was in the creek, and the food was enough. And he had learned at 63 years old, in the most uncomfortable way imaginable, that enough was a thing worth fighting for. He closed his eyes with his back against the stone, and one hand resting on Bear's broad back, and slept without dreaming, while outside the Blue Ridge held its dark and ancient shape around them, patient as it had always been, waiting to see what they would build next.